Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of our scale modeling channel. This evening we're going to start a 7-part series on super detailing the old Tamiya 1:350th scale USS Missouri. When I built this kit, and this is the second one I built, the first one I built was about 40 years ago, but this kit, when I built it, I used a lot of 3D printed parts, which have only recently become readily available for all of us modelers. So, if you follow my steps in our 7-part series, you'll be able to build an exquisite replica of the USS Missouri. So, let's get started. A tape-up of your model should always be the first step. All the main parts should be marked, removed, cleaned up, and taped together to check the fit. This step also allows you to start thinking about the detailing, construction, and painting sequences that you're going to use in building your model. The forward superstructure inserts will need some extra plastic added to get a tighter fit. Some of these seams can be hidden with small lengths of plastic. Others will need to be filled with super glue and scraped and sanded smooth, or filled with white glue after priming and painting. This seam on the aft part of the superstructure will need to be carefully filled with super glue and sanded smooth. Checking the deck inserts showed a void between the middle deck section and the forward deck section. The aft deck section fit can be improved by sanding the edges of the deck inserts flat. The fit of the starboard side deck insert is very tight and will only need a tiny amount of super glue along the seam line. To get a better fit of the forward deck, remove the positioning tabs on the inside lip of the hull. There is a mold seam line which runs across the entire length of the bottom of the hull. Careful wet sanding will remove it. These mold lines can also be wet sanded smooth. The mold tree attachment points are slightly indented and will need to be filled with super glue and then sanded smooth. The mold line on the bow will need to be carefully scraped flat with a sharp number 11 X-Acto blade and then wet sanded smooth with fine grit sandpaper. The mold line on the stern can also be wet sanded smooth with fine grit sandpaper. When you're done with all the sanding, be sure to polish the plastic with very fine steel wool pads. To improve the appearance of the bow area, drill out the plastic from the inside area of the anchor holes. Next, increase the size of the hole by cutting out the plastic from between the drill holes using the tip of a sharp number 11 X-Acto blade. Be careful not to gouge the edges of the openings. You can then shape the openings with a set of round microfiles. The holes in the hull for the outer propeller shafts can be improved by first filling in the holes from the inside of the hull with 0.1 by 0.156 inch lengths of plastic. A pilot hole was centered onto each plastic insert in preparation for drilling. The propeller shaft holes were drilled out to a 0.081 inch diameter to accept 0.072 inch brass rod. This will allow for a little play in the fit. The outer propeller V-struts were reamed out to accept the 0.072 inch diameter brass rod. The inner shaft holes were drilled out to 0.076 inch diameter to accept the same diameter rod. Each propeller was marked on the inside of a blade so they wouldn't get mixed up. The shaft openings on the propellers were also carefully opened up to accept the new brass shaft diameter. The brass pedestal locations were measured and marked on the lower hull. The stems on the brass pedestals are 0.234 inches in diameter. Pilot holes were drilled into the hull first, and then the holes were slowly enlarged to 0.236 inches in diameter. After the pilot holes were drilled through the hull, stacks of 0.04 inch thick plastic was superglued into place. The holes for the pedestals were drilled through the stacks of plastic so that the super glue, which would hold the pedestals in place, would seep out of the top onto the inside of the hull. With the hull cleaned up, the pedestal holes drilled out, and the anchor holes and shaft locations completed, it's time to start working on the main deck. The brass pedestals are 1.5-inch high lamp risers, and they were purchased on eBay. The risers are polished with steel wool pads and then given a coat of clear gloss to seal in and prevent tarnishing. The brass chain is 24 links per inch, and it will be airbrushed flat black and used for the anchor chain. The smaller black chain is actually HO scale model railroad chain, and it will be used for the minesweep chain. The molded-on anchor chain was carefully scraped off using a sharp X-Acto stencil knife. The surface was wet sanded smooth with fine grit sandpaper wrapped around a length of balsa wood. The molded-on minesweep chain was also removed with the stencil knife. The plastic surface on the elevated section of the chain locations was smoothed out using a fine grit sanding rod. With the molded-on chain details removed and the surface wet sanded smooth to remove any scrape marks, it's time to start the detailing process. The chain holes for both the anchor and the minesweep chain, which is at the tip of the bow, were carefully drilled out. The openings were enlarged with the tip of a number 11 X-Acto blade and then shaped with a round microfile. The poorly molded-on capstan for the minesweep chain was drilled out from the underside with a .081-inch bit, and the existing hole was drilled out with a .062 bit. The holes were filled with .08-inch and .06-inch rod respectively. To make a new minesweep capstan, a length of .080 rod was shaped with the tip of a round microfile using the adjustable chuck on my Dremel motor tool. The shaping was done at a low speed so the plastic wouldn't melt. The depth of the cut into the plastic rod was checked with the HO scale chain. With the top and the bottom of the capstan marked, the cuts were done with a Northwest short line chopper. The minesweep chain capstan is complete. A .026-inch hole was drilled into the bottom, and a length of .025-inch diameter plastic rod was inserted and glued into place. This rod will serve as a locating pin. The minesweep chain follower was made with a length of .06 by .08-inch plastic. One end was notched and then opened up with the edge of a flat microfile. Here again, a locating pin was attached to the new part. Note the new locations for the capstan, the two chain followers, and the hole for the chain. The two chain followers were made with my trusty Waldron punch tool. The chain follower locations were marked, and then I used the bow 20mm platform to make sure there was no interference with these parts and the platform. The base and the top of the chain guides are .015-inch thick, and they were punched out with the number 4 Waldron punch. The center section is a .04-inch thick piece of plastic and punched with the number 2 Waldron punch, and then centered onto the top and bottom parts. The brass anchor chain required that the chain capstans be slightly higher, so inserts were made from .015-inch thick plastic. The inserts were made with a Waldron punch tool. The new capstan height was checked to be sure the chain wrapped tightly around it. Anchor chain deck hole covers were made using 1/8-inch plastic tubing. The inside diameter was made larger with a .067-inch bit and then cut at an angle. It took several tries to get the two the same angle and length. The anchor chain holes in the deck were drilled out with a .063-inch bit and angled toward the capstans. The chain covers were then carefully superglued into place. The completed chain enhancements look much better than the original deck part. The chain brake locations were drilled out with a .063-inch bit and then filled with .060-inch rod. Covers were made with .010-inch thick plastic punched out with a number 3 Waldron punch tool. The deck insert edges were angled, so they were run across a stationary length of sandpaper and wet sanded flat. With the deck edges flat, the fit of the aft and midsection deck lengths is much tighter. The deck seams will need a tiny bead of superglue applied with a .012-inch diameter wire before being wet sanded smooth. To help support the deck seams, lengths of plastic were carefully glued to the undersides of the forward and after deck sections. They need to sit flat, and no superglue can seep out or it'll affect the fit of the mid-deck section. The Gold Medal Models Photoetch detail set for this kit has a lot of really cool surface details. I used slow set superglue to attach all the hatch details to the deck. Each part was picked up with a toothpick with a flat end that was moistened and then carefully positioned, and the slow set gives you about 5 to 8 seconds of working time. The Gold Medal Models deck hatches really provide some nice enhancements for the deck surfaces, and with the forward and aft deck section details added, it's time to start detailing the center deck section. The center area of the hull was slightly wider than the center deck section. With the aft and center deck sections taped in place, a cross brace was carefully form-fitted into place to get a tighter fit of the center deck section. The molded-on incline ladders on the forward part of the center deck section were carefully shaved down with a sharp number 11 X-Acto blade. The surfaces where the incline ladders were located was wet sanded smooth with a small sanding stick. The whaleboat boat cradles were then carefully snipped off. The remaining boat cradle stubs were carefully shaved off with a number 11 X-Acto blade. The boat cradle locations were then carefully wet sanded smooth with fine grit sandpaper wrapped around a length of balsa wood. Porthole height gauges were made from .04 by .0156-inch strips. Horizontal lines were drawn using a sharp pencil tip at the tops of the gauges on the superstructure sides and then marked for the approximate porthole locations. I used the floating dry dock drawings to locate the portholes on the sides of the superstructure. A center punch was used to indent the plastic at the marked locations. Portholes were initially drilled out using a .028-inch drill bit, and then a .040-inch bit was used to set the porthole diameters. For portholes that were off-centered, plastic rod was superglued into the holes. The rod was then carefully cut flush to the side and sanded smooth, and the portholes were re-drilled. The filled portholes were checked with silver paint to be sure the surfaces were flat with no seams or voids. The hatch locations were set using the same floating dry dock drawings. An oversized section of sheet plastic was used to ensure the bottoms of the Photoetch hatches were flush with the superstructure bottom. To be sure each hatch was straight, a small triangle was used. A flattened toothpick with a tiny strip of masking tape on the tip set each hatch into place with a tiny drop of slow-set superglue. The scratch-built vents were made with .04 by .06-inch lengths of plastic. The tops were curved by running them across a stationary piece of sandpaper, and then each one was cut to length, which was about 1/8 of an inch long, using a short line chopper to cut the parts. The tiny Photoetch vent pipes were set in place with a toothpick with a moistened end. Tiny drops of white glue were used to attach them to the side of the superstructure. The center deck section superstructure side detailing is complete, and now it's time to add the plastic inserts to fill the deck voids. The port side strip is 0.06 by 0.08 inches, and the starboard side strip is 0.04 by 0.08 inches. The thickness of the deck is 0.08 inches, so be sure to set the lengths correctly. The plastic inserts need to be flush with the deck. The center deck section was taped into place, and the aft superstructure sides were glued into place. By pressing the parts against the side of the superstructure while gluing, you can greatly reduce the seams where the arrows are pointing. A tiny bead of superglue was applied along the seam lines using a 0.012-inch diameter stiff wire. The seams were then carefully and lightly scraped and then wet sanded smooth with a small sanding stick. Silver paint was used to check for any flaws. The vertical seam on the aft area of the superstructure was filled with superglue and carefully wet sanded smooth. Here again, silver paint was used to detect any remaining flaws. Stay tuned to our channel for part 2, where we detail the upper superstructure parts and then glue the deck to the hull. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed part 1 of our 7-part series on super detailing the Tamiya 1 to 350th scale USS Missouri. And with that, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, give us a thumbs up, and if you get the chance, visit our website at www.mikeashley.com, where you're going to find dozens and dozens of free PDF downloads, including my old scale modeling books. And once we start publishing this series, you're going to be able to go on our website and get PDF downloads of all of the pictures that are associated with this project. Have a great evening.